The morning rush at McDonald's buzzed with the usual chorus of cheerful chatter, clinking trays, and sizzling grills. Parents juggled kids, coffee, and breakfast orders, while employees hustled to keep up with the flow. Among the crowd, Big Shaq, the larger-than-life internet sensation known for his humor and iconic catchphrases, was in line. His towering frame and infectious personality drew a few curious glances, but he seemed content to blend into the hustle and bustle, casually ordering his go-to meal. Shaq wasn't there for any grand gesture or promotional stunt. He was just a guy craving some McDonald's breakfast. He was all smiles, joking with the staff, taking a selfie or two with fans, and enjoying the laid-back atmosphere. But as he stepped aside to wait for his food, something peculiar caught his attention. A little boy, no older than 5, standing near the soda fountain, glancing nervously around the restaurant. The boy was small, with messy hair and big, curious eyes that darted from person to person. He clutched a crumpled paper cup as if holding on to it for dear life and seemed out of place amidst the chaos. Shaq, always observant despite his playful demeanor, noticed the boy's unease. At first, he assumed the kid might have just wandered off from his family. It wasn't uncommon to see kids running around in places like this. But there was something about this boy, something in the way he hesitated, as though summoning courage to do something important. Before Shaq could react, the boy made a beeline toward him. His tiny footsteps seemed deliberate but hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he was making the right move. Standing in Shaq's towering shadow, he tugged gently at the edge of Shaq's hoodie. "Mister?" the boy whispered, his voice trembling so softly it was almost drowned out by the sounds of the restaurant. Shaq knelt down to meet the boy's gaze, his warm smile instantly putting the child at ease. "What's up, little man?" he asked. His deep voice softened with genuine curiosity. The boy's eyes darted around again, scanning the room as if he was looking for someone, or avoiding someone. Then with a shaky breath he leaned in closer and whispered something into Shaq's ear. Shaq's expression shifted in an instant. The smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet concern. Whatever the boy had said was enough to make him straighten up, scanning the room with a new intensity. His playful demeanor was gone, replaced by a seriousness that seemed out of place in a fast food restaurant. The boy tugged at his sleeve again. "Please," he whispered, barely audible. Shaq didn't hesitate. He reached for his phone, his massive hands fumbling slightly as he swiped through the screen. The air around them seemed to shift, the lively chatter of the restaurant becoming a distant hum. He dialed 911, his voice calm but firm as he relayed what had just happened. "Yeah, I'm at McDonald's and I need some help," he said, his eyes still scanning the room. "A little boy just told me something, and I think it's serious." The operator's voice buzzed on the other end, asking for details. Shaq nodded as if they could see him, lowering his voice so the boy wouldn't feel more frightened. "He's just a kid, maybe 5 or 6. He looks scared, and whatever he told me, I can't ignore it." As Shaq spoke, the boy clung to his side, his small hand gripping the fabric of Shaq's hoodie. The boy glanced nervously at the door, and for a brief moment, Shaq followed his gaze. A man near the entrance caught Shaq's eye, an average-looking guy in a plain jacket, sipping coffee and pretending to scroll through his phone. But something about him didn't sit right. The man's eyes flicked toward Shaq and the boy, and for a split second, their gazes locked. The man's expression froze, and then he turned away, slipping out of the door as if he were in a hurry to be anywhere but there. Shaq's gut told him this wasn't just a coincidence. Something was off, and the boy's whisper had set off a chain reaction that couldn't be ignored. The operator's voice pulled him back to the present. "Stay where you are," they instructed. "Help is on the way." But staying put wasn't in Shaq's nature. His instincts screamed that time was of the essence. He looked down at the boy, who was still clutching his hoodie, eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Don't worry, buddy," Shaq said, his voice steady. "We've got this. You're safe with me." What exactly had the boy whispered? What danger was lurking just beyond the doors of this McDonald's? And who was the man that had slipped away so suddenly? As the minutes ticked by, the answers felt closer. But so did the tension, hanging heavy in the air like a storm, waiting to break. The air inside the McDonald's felt heavier now, the usual clamor fading into a dull backdrop. Shaq stood tall, his hand resting reassuringly on the boy's shoulder, a silent promise that he wouldn't let anything happen to him. The little boy still hadn't said another word since his whispered plea, but his wide, worried eyes told Shaq all he needed to know. This wasn't something to brush off. Shaq's mind raced, piecing together what little he knew. The boy had spoken so softly, but the message was unmistakable. "He's watching me. I don't want to go with him." Those words had sent a chill through Shaq that he hadn't felt in years, not since his days playing in high-stakes basketball. Games where the entire arena's energy could turn in an instant. But this wasn't a game. Looking around the restaurant, Shaq spotted families enjoying their meals, teenagers chatting, and employees hustling to keep orders flowing. On the surface, it was a typical morning, but now he saw it differently. Every corner, every exit, every person felt like a potential clue or threat. He couldn't shake the image of the man who had slipped out moments earlier. "Where's your family, little man?" Shaq asked, gently, lowering his voice so as not to scare the boy. The boy hesitated, his fingers tightening around the hem of Shaq's hoodie. "My mom, she's not here," he mumbled. That answer hit Shaq harder than he expected. Not here could mean 100 things, none of them good. "What about your dad?" The boy shook his head quickly, almost instinctively. "He's not nice." Shaq's heart sank a little further. It was clear this kid was carrying a lot more than any 5-year-old should. But there wasn't time to unpack everything now. His priority was keeping the boy safe until the police arrived. A subtle movement near the counter caught Shaq's eye. Another man, dressed casually but with an air of quiet tension, was watching them from across the room. He wasn't trying to be obvious, but Shaq had spent years reading people, on the court, in the media, everywhere. This man wasn't here. For an egg McMuffin. Shaq leaned down toward the boy again, keeping his tone calm. "Do you know that man over there?" he asked, nodding slightly toward the counter. The boy glanced quickly, his face paling. He pressed himself closer to Shaq, shaking his head in small, frantic motions. "No, but he knows me." The words sent another ripple of unease through Shaq. He straightened up, his presence commanding but unthreatening. If this man wanted to cause trouble, he'd have to think twice about going through someone as big and protective as Shaq. The man must have realized he'd been noticed because he grabbed a tray and pretended to adjust the coffee cup on it. Then, without another glance, he made his way to the door and stepped outside. Shaq's gut told him this wasn't over. Whoever these men were, they weren't random. And whatever the boy had gotten tangled up in, it was serious enough to make grown men act shady in public. As Shaq kept one eye on the door and one on the boy, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was the 911 dispatcher calling back. He answered quickly, explaining the situation in more detail this time. "He's just a little guy," Shaq said, his voice calm but firm. "Says he doesn't want to go with someone, and too different. Men have been acting real suspicious since I've been here. One already left, and the other just stepped outside." "Stay with the child," the dispatcher instructed. "Officers are en route, and they'll be there shortly. Don't confront anyone unless it's necessary, and try to keep the boy calm." Shaq nodded, though his mind was already spinning with possible scenarios. Confrontation wasn't off the table if it came to that, but he wasn't about to put the boy in more danger by acting recklessly. After hanging up, he crouched down again, making sure the boy could see his face. "Hey, you're doing great, buddy. The police are coming to help us, okay?" The boy looked unsure but nodded anyway. His little hands finally let go of Shaq's hoodie, though he stayed close like he wasn't quite ready to lose the sense of safety Shaq provided. "What's your name?" Shaq asked, hoping to keep the boy talking and distracted from whatever fear was gnawing at him. "Ethan," the boy said quietly. "That's a strong name," Shaq said, smiling. "I bet you're real brave too, huh?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't feel brave." "Sometimes being brave doesn't feel like it," Shaq replied. "Sometimes it's just doing the right thing, even when you're scared. And you did the right thing telling me. You're a brave kid, Ethan." Ethan didn't respond, but the faintest hint of a smile flickered across his face before disappearing again. As they waited, Shaq noticed the man who had stepped outside earlier was now pacing near the parking lot, glancing occasionally toward the restaurant. Every instinct in Shaq screamed that this man was connected to the boy's fear, but without more information, he couldn't act impulsively. "Do you know why those men are watching you, Ethan?" Shaq asked gently, careful not to pressure him. Ethan hesitated, then nodded slowly. They said they know my mom, but she told me to stay away from them." "Did your mom tell you where she went?" Ethan shook his head, his face crumpling. "She said she'd be back, but she didn't come back, and then they came." Shaq's heart broke for the boy. It was clear Ethan's mom was trying to protect him, but whatever had happened, she wasn't here now, and those men weren't here to help. Just then, the sound of distant sirens cut through the morning air, growing louder by the second. Relief washed over Shaq, though he stayed alert. He wasn't sure what the men outside might do, now that help was on the way. Ethan perked up at the sound too, his expression softening for the first time. "They're coming?" he asked, hope creeping into his voice. "They're coming," Shaq confirmed, giving the boy's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. As the sirens grew closer, the man in the parking lot suddenly broke into a hurried walk, heading toward a black car parked at the edge of the lot. Shaq made a mental note of the car's make and model, as well as part of the license plate. The tension in the air was thick as the first police car pulled into the lot, its lights flashing. Shaq felt a small sense of victory seeing the man's car peel out of the lot, but he knew this wasn't over. Not yet. One of the officers stepped inside, scanning the room before spotting Shaq and Ethan near the back. Shaq raised a hand to signal them over. The officer approached, her presence calm but authoritative. "You the one who called?" she asked Shaq, glancing down at Ethan. "Yeah," Shaq replied. "This little guy's been through a lot. He told me some things you'll want to hear." As Ethan clung to Shaq's side, the officer knelt down to his level, offering a kind smile. "Hi, Ethan. My name's Officer Harris. I'm here to help, okay?" Ethan hesitated, but finally nodded, his small voice barely audible. "Okay." Shaq watched as the officer gently started asking Ethan questions, her demeanor putting him at ease. But even as the situation seemed to calm, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The man who had left, the one who had whispered, what had they been after? And more importantly, where was Ethan's mom? The tension in the restaurant didn't fully dissipate, even as Officer Harris carefully spoke with Ethan. Shaq stood nearby, his arms crossed, scanning the room like a human shield, his protective instincts firing on all cylinders. He couldn't stop replaying the scene in his head, the nervous glances, the man pacing in the parking lot, and Ethan's whispered words. Something wasn't adding up, and Shaq knew better than to dismiss his gut feelings. Ethan had begun to relax slightly under Officer Harris's calm and kind demeanor. She asked simple questions, giving him the space to speak without pressuring him. "Ethan, can you tell me when you last saw your mom?" Ethan's little hands fiddled with the hem of his shirt as he answered. "Last night. We were at a house. She told me to stay in my room, but I heard people talking. Then she came in and told me we had to go. We left really fast." Shaq leaned in slightly, listening carefully. Ethan's words painted a picture that was both vague and chilling. A late-night escape, men following them, and now Ethan alone in a McDonald's with strangers lurking around. "Do you remember what the house looked like?" Officer Harris asked gently. Ethan shook his head. "It was dark, and I was scared." Shaq could see how hard this was for Ethan. The little boy was trying to be brave, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "What about the men?" Harris continued. "Did you see their faces?" Ethan nodded slightly. "One of them came to my door. He said he needed to talk to my mom. She yelled at him to leave us alone, but he wouldn't go." Officer Harris exchanged a brief look with her partner, who had joined them quietly. "Do you think you'd recognize him if you saw him again?" "Maybe," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling. Shaq couldn't hold back anymore. "What about the guy who left earlier? The one pacing outside before you got here? He and boy made eye contact, and the kid clung to me like he'd seen a ghost." Harris straightened up, her professional calm unwavering. "We're checking the area now. Did you get a good look at him?" "Better than that. I saw the car he left in, a black sedan, mid-2000s, with part of the plate reading J4R. Harris nodded, scribbling the details into her notebook. "That's helpful. We'll follow up." Shaq didn't miss the subtle tension in her face. This wasn't a simple missing person case, and they both knew it. Whatever Ethan and his mom had been running from, it wasn't just some misunderstanding. Outside, the flashing lights of another patrol car illuminated the lot. Officers spread out, speaking to bystanders and scanning the area. Shaq watched as a few employees were questioned near the counter, their faces curious but concerned. Meanwhile, Ethan's story was beginning to piece together a troubling picture. "They said we had to give them something," Ethan said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Officer Harris tilted her head slightly. "Give them what?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head, his tiny frame trembling. "I don't know. My mum just kept saying we didn't have it anymore, that they needed to leave us alone." Shaq crouched down to Ethan's level, his massive hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. "You're doing great, little man. You don't have to remember everything right now. Just tell us what you can." Ethan sniffled, nodding but staying quiet. Whatever these men were after, it was clear they were willing to go to great lengths to get it, and Ethan's mom had been desperate to keep it away from them. As the minutes ticked by, the officers outside returned with an update. "We didn't. You find the black sedan," one of them said, his tone apologetic, "but we're putting out an alert based on the description." Shaq's jaw tightened. Whoever these men were, they were slippery, and clearly aware that the police might get involved. Then, as if on cue, Shaq's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, half expecting another call from the dispatcher, but the number on the screen wasn't familiar. His brows furrowed as he hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" There was a pause on the other end, followed by a low, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. "Stay out of it." "Who is this?" The voice didn't answer his question. "This isn't your problem. Leave the kid with the cops and walk away." Shaq's grip on the phone tightened, his free hand balling into a fist. "You think you can threaten me? You've got the wrong guy." The voice chuckled darkly. "You're a big man, Shaq, but even big men can't protect everyone." Before Shaq could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone, anger and unease swirling in his chest. Whoever was behind this knew who he was, and they weren't afraid to make it personal. Shaq glanced at Officer Harris, his expression serious. "I just got a call. Somebody told me to back off. They know I'm involved." Harris's face hardened. "Did they say anything else?" "Just to walk away. Said I couldn't protect everyone." The officer exchanged another look with her, in partner, then turned back to Shaq. "This confirms they're watching. But it also means they're desperate. Desperation makes people sloppy." Shaq nodded, though the weight of the situation settled heavily on him. This wasn't just about Ethan or his mom anymore. Whoever these people were, they didn't care about collateral damage. As the officers coordinated with dispatch, Shaq noticed Ethan sitting quietly by himself, his small shoulders hunched. The boy looked so small, so lost. Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here today, that fate or something like it had put him in that McDonald's at just the right moment. Walking over, Shaq sat down on the bench beside Ethan, careful not to crowd him. "Hey, you holding up okay?" Ethan nodded, but his eyes were still watery. "I miss my mom," he whispered. Shaq swallowed the lump in his throat. "I know, buddy. We're gonna find her, and we're not gonna let those guys hurt you, okay?" The boy looked up at him, searching his face for reassurance. "Promise?" Shaq didn't hesitate. "I promise." As he sat there, watching the boys slowly lean against him for comfort, Shaq knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The men chasing Ethan weren't going to give up, and finding his mom might be the only way to truly keep him safe. But where was she? And what had she been protecting that was worth risking everything? Those answers felt just out of reach, dangling like pieces of a puzzle waiting to fall into place. The hum of police radios buzzed in the background, mingling with the faint chatter of McDonald's patrons, still unaware of the storm brewing. Shaq sat with Ethan by his side, the boy's small frame leaning into him as if Shaq's presence alone could keep the danger at bay. But even Shaq, as big and confident as he was, felt the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. He had promised Ethan that everything would be okay, but with the cryptic phone call still echoing in his mind, he wasn't so sure. Outside, Officer Harris and her partner coordinated with other officers, their voices low and urgent. The mention of surveillance footage and widening the search perimeter carried through the open door, but none of it seemed to move the needle closer to finding Ethan's mom or uncovering why these men were after them. Shaq could tell they were working as fast as they could, but time felt like it was slipping through their fingers. "Shaq?" Ethan's voice was soft, barely above a whisper. He looked up at him with wide, searching eyes. "What if they find me again?" Shaq knelt down, putting himself at eye level with the boy. "Listen, little man, I'm not gonna let that happen. You've got me, you've got Officer Harris, and you've got a whole lot of people looking out for you now. Those guys don't stand a chance." Ethan nodded, but the fear in his eyes lingered. Shaq wanted to say more, but before he could, Harris stepped back inside, her expression sharp and focused. "Shaq, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked, motioning for him to step away. He gave Ethan a reassuring pat on the shoulder, before standing and following Harris to a quiet corner of the restaurant. Her voice dropped to a low whisper as she spoke. "We've got a lead. Dispatch just got a report of a woman matching Ethan's. Mom's description seen running into a convenience store about 3 miles from here. She looked distressed and was asking for help." Shaq's heart jumped. "So she's alive?" "We believe so," Harris replied. "But there's more. The person who reported it said she wasn't alone. 2 men followed her in and she ran out the back before they could catch her." Shaq exhaled slowly, his mind racing. "So they're closing in?" "Exactly. If they're still tracking her, they're not far behind. And if they figure out we've got Ethan, they'll come here," Shaq finished, his jaw tightening. Harris nodded. "We've already got units moving toward the area to find her, but I need you to be ready. If they show up here, I want you to stay with Ethan no matter what happens." Shaq didn't need to be told twice. "You've got it." As Harris moved back toward her partner, Shaq returned to Ethan, who was fiddling nervously with the strap of his backpack. The boy looked up as Shaq sat down again, sensing the tension in his face. "Did they find my mom?" Ethan asked quietly. Shaq hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "They think so. She's not far and the police are going to find her. But we've got to stay here and wait for her, okay?" Ethan nodded, though his grip on the backpack tightened. Shaq couldn't help but notice the way the boy hugged it close, as if it held something precious. "What's in there, little man?" Shaq asked gently, nodding toward the bag. Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting to the backpack and then back to Shaq. "Just my stuff," he said quickly. Too quickly. Shaq raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. Whatever was in that bag, it clearly mattered to Ethan, and he wasn't about to make him feel more scared than he already was. Still, Shaq couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with why those men were after them. Outside, the faint sound of a car engine caught Shaq's attention. He glanced out the window just in time to see a black SUV pull into the far end of the parking lot, its windows tinted so dark it was impossible to see inside. The SUV slowed, its tires crunching on the pavement before coming to a stop. It didn't park. It just sat there, idling. Shaq's entire body tensed. He didn't need to be a detective to know that this wasn't just some random customer looking for a breakfast sandwich. Harris noticed it too. She stepped outside, speaking into her radio as her partner moved toward the vehicle, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. The tension in the air was palpable, every second stretching out like an eternity. Shaq glanced back at Ethan, who had noticed the change in energy. The boy's eyes darted toward the window, and his face went pale. "That's them," he whispered, his voice trembling. Shaq's heart pounded. "It's okay," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Stay with me, buddy, I've got you." The SUV's engine revved once, then fell silent as the vehicle shut off. The driver's door opened slowly, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark jacket. He paused, scanning the area, his gaze landing briefly on the restaurant before moving on. Two more men stepped out from the back, their movements deliberate and synchronized. They didn't look like they were there to order breakfast. Shaq could feel the tension crackling in the air, like a live wire. Inside, Harris's partner had returned, his voice low and firm as he spoke into his radio. "We've got 3 male suspects on site, requesting backup ASAP." Shaq's focus stayed on Ethan, who was gripping the backpack so tightly his knuckles were white. "Ethan, listen to me," Shaq said, his voice calm but urgent. "No matter what happens, you stay. Right here with me, okay? Don't move unless I tell you." Ethan nodded, his wide eyes locked on Shaq. The men outside began walking toward the restaurant, their movements casual but purposeful. Harris stepped in front of the door, her stance firm as she addressed them. Shaq couldn't hear what she was saying, but her body language made it clear they weren't welcome. The man in the dark jacket stopped a few feet from her, his hands in his pockets. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Whatever he said in response, it made Harris's expression harden. Shaq felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment everything would come to a head. The tension outside the McDonald's was suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of what was about to unfold. Shaq kept his eyes on the fire. Seen beyond the glass, every muscle in his body coiled and ready, he could see Officer Harris standing her ground, her hand resting on her belt. The man in the dark jacket was still speaking, his expression calm and unsettlingly confident. The other 2 men flanked him, their presence a silent threat. Ethan tugged lightly at Shaq's sleeve, his voice barely audible. "They're here. For me, I know they are." Shaq glanced down at him, his massive hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "I'm not going to let them take you, little man. You stay right here with me, no matter what happens." The sound of another car engine made Shaq's head snap back toward the parking lot. A second vehicle had pulled up, a grey sedan this time, with its headlights cutting through the morning haze. The car stopped abruptly, and the doors flew open. Shaq's heart skipped a beat as a woman stumbled out, her disheveled hair framing, a face that was both terrified and determined. It was Ethan's mom. "Mom!" Ethan gasped, starting to rise from his seat, but Shaq gently held him back. "Wait!" Shaq said firmly, his eyes locked on the scene outside. Something about the way she was moving, frantic and desperate, told him this wasn't a reunion. Yet, this was something else. Ethan's mom darted toward the McDonald's entrance, her head swiveling as if she expected someone to grab her at any moment. Behind her, two more men emerged from the grey sedan, their movements sharp and aggressive. They weren't just chasing her, they were hunting her. Officer Harris immediately stepped in, her voice commanding as she called out to the approaching men. But the man in the dark jacket raised a hand, a smirk playing on his lips, as if he had been expecting this all along. Shaq didn't like it. This wasn't chaos. This was coordinated. The woman reached the door, her eyes wide with relief as she spotted Ethan inside. She yanked the door open, her voice trembling as she called, "Out, Ethan, baby, I'm here." Ethan bolted from his seat before Shaq could stop him, throwing himself into his mother's arms. The reunion was brief, though, as the men outside began moving toward the door. Shaq was on his feet in an instant, his towering frame blocking the view of Ethan and his mom. "Back off," Shaq growled, his voice low and filled with authority. "You don't want this fight." The man in the dark jacket tilted his head slightly, his smirk never wavering. "Oh, I think I do," he said, his voice as smooth as silk. Then, turning to Officer Harris, he added, "We just want what's ours. No one needs to get hurt." "What's yours?" Harris shot back, her hand now resting firmly on her holstered weapon. "The only thing you're leaving here with is a police escort." The man laughed, a cold, humorless sound that sent a chill down Shaq's spine. "You don't even know what you're protecting, do you?" His eyes shifted to Ethan's mom. "Tell them, go on. Tell them what you took." Shaq's gaze flickered to the woman, who was clutching Ethan tightly, her face pale but resolute. "I didn't take anything," she said, though her voice wavered. "You've got the wrong people." "Lying won't save you," the man said, taking a step forward. Harris immediately raised a hand to stop him, her voice sharp. "That's close enough," she warned. The man paused, his smirk fading for the first time. "This doesn't have to end badly," he said, his tone darkening. "But if you keep interfering, none of you will like the consequences." Shaq felt his fists clench at his sides, his protective instincts roaring to the surface. "You want to talk about consequences?" he said, his voice booming. "You're messing with the wrong kid and the wrong mama. And if you think I'm going to let you walk in here and scare them, you've got another thing coming." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the two of them locked in a silent standoff. But before either could make a move, Ethan's mom broke the tension. "It's not here," she said suddenly, her voice trembling but firm. "What you're looking for, it's not here, so just leave us alone." The man's smirk returned, but this time it was sharper, more predatory. "Not here, huh? Then where is it?" His gaze flicked to the backpack in Ethan's hands, and Shaq's stomach dropped. "Don't even think about it," Shaq said, stepping in front of Ethan and his mom. His sheer size made the threat all the more convincing, but the men outside didn't seem intimidated. The man in the dark jacket took another step forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "You don't understand what's at stake," he said, his tone icy. "That backpack isn't just holding a kid's toys. What's inside could ruin everything, and we're not leaving without it." Ethan clung to his backpack, his small hands gripping the straps as if his life depended on it. Shaq could see the fear in his eyes, but he could also see something else, determination. Whatever was in that bag, Ethan knew it mattered, and he wasn't about to let it fall into the wrong hands. The tension reached a breaking point as another patrol car pulled into the lot, its lights flashing. The man in the dark jacket glanced toward it, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he turned and signaled to his men. "We'll be back," he said, his voice a chilling promise. As the men retreated to their vehicles, Shaq let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. But the sense of relief was short-lived. Whatever was in that backpack had just made Ethan and his mom targets all over again, and the people after them weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. The air inside the McDonald's was thick with tension. even after the black SUV and grey sedan disappeared into the distance. Officer Harris and her partner sprang into action, calling for additional units and advising nearby patrols to set up roadblocks. Shaq stayed close to Ethan and his mum, who still clutched each other tightly. The boy's grip on his backpack hadn't loosened, and Shaq couldn't ignore the way his small body trembled despite his brave front. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice shaky but urgent. "We have to tell them." His mom froze, her face a mix of fear and indecision. Shaq's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer. "Tell us what? If there's something you're not saying, now's the time." She hesitated, looking from Shaq to Officer Harris, who had joined them again. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, you're right. You need to know." Ethan unzipped his backpack slowly, his hands shaking. From the bag, he pulled out a small, sleek device that looked like a hard drive, but with strange markings etched into its metallic casing. It was no ordinary gadget. Shaq's instincts immediately told him this was the reason those men were after them. "What is that?" Shaq asked, his voice low. It's evidence," Ethan's mom said, her voice breaking. "Evidence of things that people in power don't want anyone to see. Corruption, crimes, all tied to that company the men work for. I didn't mean to get involved. I didn't want to. But I found out too much while working there." Harris's expression turned serious. "You worked for them?" She nodded. "I was a data analyst for their subsidiary. I thought it was just a regular job, but I started noticing inconsistencies in financial records, payments going to off-the-books accounts, contracts with dangerous people. When I dug deeper, I found this." She gestured to the device. "It's a copy of their internal files, names, transactions, everything." Harris's hand instinctively moved to her radio, her professional demeanor unshaken. "You're saying this drive could expose them?" "Yes," she replied, "but once they realized I had it, they came after me. I didn't know where to go. I just wanted to keep Ethan safe." Shaq's eyes were fixed on the hard drive. "So, this isn't just some small-time operation. We're talking big players." "Big enough to have resources everywhere," Harris added grimly. "We need to move fast. If they figure out where you're headed, they won't stop." As Harris coordinated with her partner to secure transport for Ethan and his mum, Shaq noticed something in the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement in the parking lot. His massive frame tensed as he stepped closer to the window, scanning the area. At first, he saw nothing. Then, "We've got company," there it was, said, his voice shadow darting
Harris
between
followed
cars,
his gaze,
her
too
hand
quick to be
moving
casual.
to her weapon. "Get back inside, now!" The calm exploded into chaos as the glass front of the restaurant shattered, sending shards flying. The men had returned, and this time they weren't holding back. Shaq grabbed Ethan and his mum, shielding them with his body as Harris and her partner drew their weapons. "Stay low!" Shaq barked, his voice booming over the chaos. The next moments blurred into a frenzy of movement and noise. Harris returned fire, forcing the attackers to scatter, while her partner called for immediate backup. Shaq focused on keeping Ethan and his mom out of harm's way, ushering them toward the back of the restaurant. The hard drive was still clutched tightly in Ethan's small hands. One of the men managed to break through, his eyes locking onto the boy. He lunged forward, but Shaq was faster. With a single powerful swing, he knocked the attacker to the ground. The impact left no doubt that Shaq meant business. "You picked the wrong McDonald's," Shaq growled, standing over the man. But even as he subdued the threat, another attacker emerged, this one headed straight for Ethan. Then it happened. Ethan, small but brave, stepped forward and hurled the hard drive across the room with all his might. It smashed against the floor, breaking apart and revealing what was hidden inside, a tiny chip no bigger than a fingernail. The man froze, his eyes widening. "No!" he shouted, scrambling toward the chip. But before he could reach it, Harris acted. She fired a precise shot, hitting the floor inches from his hand. "Don't move," she commanded, her voice steel. The man hesitated, then slowly raised his hands in surrender as the sound of sirens filled the air. Reinforcements arrived within moments, flooding the scene with flashing lights and armed officers. The attackers were quickly detained, and the chip was recovered, now safely in Harris's possession. Ethan and his mom were finally safe, though the weight of what they had been through was written all over their faces. As the dust settled, Shaq knelt down in front of Ethan, his expression softening. "You're one brave little dude, you know that?" Ethan managed a small smile, his arms wrapping tightly around Shaq in a hug. "Thank you," he said, his voice muffled against Shaq's shoulder. Shaq ruffled the boy's hair, a rare smile spreading across his own face. "Any time, buddy, any time." But just as everything seemed resolved, Harris approached. Her face pale, she held up the chip. This isn't the only one," she said. "It's part of a set. If they're this desperate for one piece, imagine what's on the rest." Shaq frowned, the gravity of her words sinking in. "So this isn't over?" Harris nodded grimly. "Not by a long shot."